Granniopteryx, granniopteryx. She knows the truth, she's linking every link.
Hello. A while ago I was talking about problems in the NHS, and I have been discussing with somebody who used to work for the NHS about the number of foreign doctors working in the NHS, the various departments, the hospitals, general practice, that sort of thing. And he's told me some quite shocking figures, and I'm going to just give a few of them to you. I won't be able to do a whole rundown because I'm going to be reading a letter which was sent to me by one of my subscribers. You'll see it there. But the most recent official data, got it written down here, from the UK Parliament's House of Commons Library, which was updated in November 2025, so that's a few months ago now, indicates that 36% of doctors in England's NHS, that includes hospitals, community services, all sorts of medical facilities. 36% of them are non-British nationality. This figure excludes those with unknown nationality. There are some that just haven't identified themselves in any questionnaire one way or the other. Note that this is specifically by nationality, not place of training or birth. So we have 36% of doctors in England, they're quoting English figures here, 36% of them are of foreign nationality, but we don't know how many of them are British now, but not born here, and some of them might not even be qualified in Britain, that still aren't in that 36% figure. The General Medical Council reported in its 2025 workforce report that around 42% of licensed doctors working in the UK qualified abroad. So this is apart from the 36% who are of foreign nationality. 42% of doctors working in this country qualified abroad. Is that not a shocking figure? It means we aren't teaching our own doctors. We aren't using our own doctors. Now, you can go all woke and pretend you're worrying about third world countries and that we're bleeding third world countries of the sort of people who can become doctors and leaving third world countries uncared for. Because, of course, anyone who's relatively bright, and I'm not saying that they're geniuses, I'm saying that they are brighter than the average in their country, and they see that they can earn a much better living if they're working in Britain in the NHS than, driving around sandy roads to visit people who can hardly write. Okay, I know a lot of the third world isn't like that, but a lot is as well. They are going to choose the modern, high-tech, whatever we say about Britain, much better circumstances of Britain, So if you want to pretend that you're really worried about the rest of the third world, then you will say, yes, we're bleeding these countries of their resources. That's usually just a cover. What most people are irritated about is, first of all, that British people can't get into the medical training establishments because they are so restricted. After all, why should the NHS pay to train doctors when they can just get them from elsewhere. And then when they actually get into the doctor's office, they discover that they can't talk to the doctor, or they can't understand what the doctor's saying. At that point, you're not worrying about bleeding the third world. You're worrying about your own bleeding. England has around 3.2 doctors per 1,000 people. And this creates persistent shortages. There are over 10,000 doctor vacancies, with some specialities facing 15% shortfalls. So it's not only the fact that the doctor you get you can't understand, but you can't get a doctor a lot of the time, understandable or not. It's a bad situation, and I'm going to show you how bad by reading this letter from a subscriber I shall call Matthew. And I shall explain to you that a DNAR notice means do not attempt resuscitation. That's put on the medical sheet that's clipped to the bed of patients who have said they don't wish to be brought back if they have a heart attack or something like that. But the patient has to say that. I have to emphasize this because you will see a slightly different attitude displayed in this letter. All right. Matthew writes as follows. My father, I'll call him Dad, became quite frail and bad on his legs in the last few months of his life. He had a series of falls in the sheltered accommodation where he lived. Although he was fortunately never injured, the paramedics who attended always took him to the Royal Staffordshire Hospital to be checked. This in itself became a nightmare because it invariably took days. You see, this is another problem. This happens a lot in England. It happened to the husband of a friend of mine. They go to hospital and then they spend 3 or 4 days in the hospital doing nothing and not being seen until a doctor comes round to finally to assess them. And this is a problem because it means they are blocking the beds while they're waiting. And Matthew describes a similar situation. He didn't want to be there. That is, when he had a fall, procedurally, they took him to hospital because they had to. That was the procedure. And then in hospital, he had to wait probably in A&E for 5 or 6 hours. And then they would admit him to the hospital and keep him hanging around there for 3 or 4 days until a doctor saw him and said, there's nothing wrong with you. You can go home now. That is part of the procedure and all of the problem. He didn't want to be there. There was no need for him to be there, but getting a doctor to discharge him, even after nurses said he was good to go, took days. I visited him almost every night. Shortly after returning from a visit, a doctor from the hospital called on the phone around 9 p.m. He said that he was aware that I had power of attorney over Dad's medical care and wanted me to give permission for a DNAR instruction to be added to Dad's case. That is, put on the notes, so that if he suddenly went into cardiac arrest, they'd look at the notes and the notes would say DNAR and they'd say, oh, well, yeah, all right. Nature, take its course, and then, just time the death. When I say that he said these things, he's talking about the doctor who phoned him that night. When I say he said these things, I need to point out that his speech was almost undecipherable. I think his accent was Arabic. It was so strong that it took me some time to understand what it was that he wanted. It was a great shock. First, because I had left him, that is, his father, Not much more than an hour before, and aside from his general frailty, he was in fine fettle. And second, because I knew that this had been put to Dad at some point in the past, and he had said that he did want to be resuscitated if it were ever needed. I knew this because a paramedic who had previously attended after one of his falls had called up Dad's medical records on a tablet and showed it to me. So, in the event that you weren't concentrating on this letter, I shall précis it. A doctor with a very heavy accent rang Matthew and said, "I want to put a DNAR on his record. You have power of attorney. Do you agree?" And Matthew knew that his father had previously told a medical professional that he wanted to be resuscitated if such an eventuality arose. OK, we shall continue with Matthew's letter. I tried to explain this to the doctor. And here we have a small problem. I tried to explain this to the doctor, but he seemingly struggled to understand me just as much as I him. Well, I'm not so sure the doctor really didn't understand. I think the doctor just didn't see the point in that old man hanging on anymore and wanted to get it officially, out of his responsibility. However, at its most charitable, the doctor had such poor English that he couldn't understand Matthew. My position was quite clear. I would only use my powers of attorney as and when Dad was no longer mentally able to make his own decisions. That stage had not been reached, that Dad had already made his decision on the matter, and that he, the doctor, should respect Dad's wishes. Telling him this really was a nightmare. It took minutes. I don't know how many, but perhaps 5 or even more. In the end, the only thing I could say to him, very slowly, very clearly, was, "You must do what it says on my father's records. Do you understand?" It really was awful, not least because the only terms I could speak to him in, with hope of being understood, seemed rude and patronising. That is because Matthew was having to use very simple, very direct language because the doctor either did not or did not want to understand what Matthew was saying, that if his father needed resuscitation, that should be given to him straight away, in accordance with Matthew's father's wishes. OK, in different circumstances it would have been almost comedic, in a Basil Fawlty talking to Manuel sort of way. But he did say that he understood. I didn't visit the following day. I can't remember why. Maybe I had to work late. At around the same time as the night before, I received another call from a different doctor who, I promise you, was as virtually unintelligible as the first. What eventually became clear was that he was asking the same as the doctor who called the night before. I gave it a couple of minutes, during which I tried to explain, A, that I'd been through this the night before, and B, my dad must be resuscitated if necessary. In the end, I gave up and said I was coming to the hospital now. I said it as, "I come hospital now, tonight. I speak you in 1 hour, there at hospital. Most people would be very ashamed and uncomfortable of having to speak to anyone like that. And from what I know about Matthew, he's been a subscriber for a long time and has emailed me on several occasions about various things, not asking me to read stuff out, just discussing issues. He is a level-headed, logical, cultured and compassionate person. I'm quite sure that having to speak like that must have made him intensely uncomfortable. I shall continue with Matthew's letter. I drove to the hospital. I remember it was a filthy night of ice and sleet and took over an hour. When I got to Dad's ward, I made towards his bed and was intercepted by a nurse. She showed me a green A4 form in a folder, and on it was written, "Spoke to patient's son who has enduring power of attorney. Son agreed to DNAR." Either the doctor misunderstood or he was lying. I am inclined to believe he was lying, frankly. The nurse just looked at me and said, "This isn't right, is it?" So that's why I think the doctor was lying, because I think the nurse knew the doctor. I think that's what was going on. She knew what that doctor was like. She thought it didn't look right. Why should she say that to this fellow who was a stranger to her and had just come in? The nurse just looked at me and said, "This isn't right, is it?" I said it wasn't. And she said, "I thought so," and tore the page out and ripped it up, saying, "There, it's gone now." This is the state of things in our hospitals. This is why I would actually be afraid to go to a hospital now, a place of healing where you're supposed to get better. If I'd had my wits about me, continues Matthew, I would have demanded the paper, but I was quite frankly livid. I asked to see the doctor and was told he'd gone home. It's just as well, because although I am not given to violence, I don't think I would have been able to keep my hands off him. I went to my dad's bed. He was sat up, cheery as ever. I said, "Come on, you're going home." The nurse said that he shouldn't go until he was discharged, but there was no conviction in her words at all. I just said that he was coming with me. She understood and helped me get him out of bed into some clothes. Dad had a district nurse who used to visit him regularly. You see, there is a lot in the NHS that is very well done. This old guy had a district nurse who turned up every so often, regularly, I suppose maybe once a week, and she would keep an eye on him, I don't know what, make sure he was eating properly, make sure he was still had his wits about him, listen to his heart, take his blood pressure, all that sort of thing. There's much to be recommended in the NHS. You see, I'm talking about one situation here in the Royal Staffordshire Hospital, and we can't discount the fact that there are many other things in the NHS which are not only very well run, but heartwarmingly well run. Anyway, Dad had a district nurse who used to visit him regularly. Next day, I phoned her and told her what had happened. She contacted the staff at Dad's sheltered flat, gave them her mobile phone number and instructed them that if Dad had another fall, they should phone her as soon as they'd finished phoning the paramedics. Next time he had a fall, I was phoned, as usual, and in the 15 minutes it took me to rush down to Dad's place, the district nurse had already arrived. She said that she'd checked Dad out, he wasn't injured, but if the paramedics arrived, they'd insist on taking him to be checked out at the hospital. You see the little problem here? A problem of procedure and people acting like robots without, just putting the responsibility onto a set of tick boxes. So the district nurse said if the paramedics arrived, even if the old man was perfectly all right, they'd have to take him to hospital because that was their checklist. If I could lift him up onto his bed, she would cancel the ambulance. I did just that and everything was okay. He never went back to the Royal Staffordshire Hospital again. He died a few months later at home, peacefully, in his sleep, with me at his bedside. And no doubt with medication which had been given to him by the district nurse. For a while I had thoughts of pursuing a complaint, but they passed. And that's one of the problems with the NHS, you see, because the people who are mistreated in the NHS, they're very ill. If they're so ill, they won't be thinking of making complaints. And once they get better, they're just glad to be better. And reliving a bad experience is often just too much for them. And that's part of the problem. And that's not a problem that the NHS is deliberately doing. It's just one of those human things. I had raised a complaint with the NHS some years before. So Matthew had actually complained to the NHS about something else. An operation I needed was cancelled at the last minute as I was waiting in the hospital on the grounds that I had diabetes. I didn't have diabetes. So they cancelled the operation. I mean, he said he was in hospital, so that means he'd come in the night before. They'd possibly fed him that night, and then they didn't feed him in the morning, but they would have given him all the usual things. Maybe they had to shave a part of his body in preparation, or, all the rest of it. And then they cancelled the operation because he had diabetes. Somebody had written on his chart, and he didn't have diabetes. So it means somebody had written that diabetes on the chart, which must have been somebody else's chart, which means that somebody else with diabetes was being operated on without them knowing it. I think they mixed my records up with someone else's. Yeah, well, that's an obvious conclusion. Even I worked that one out. So I knew it would be a deeply frustrating process that the paper record was gone, and that even if it hadn't, I would have got nowhere with it. And that's the other thing. There are too many pen pushers, or rather paper pushers, in the NHS, just pushing papers from one desk to the next. And Matthew didn't want a heart attack. He just wanted this minor op to be dealt with. Right, now, that's the end of his first letter. After that, when I asked him permission to read his letter out, he sent me some further, what you might call, infill, which I'm going to tell you about now. There's a backstory to this which might be of interest. When Dad first became unwell, he was still living in Birmingham. His care needs had been assessed and he was allotted a social worker. As I had power of attorney, I had several phone conversations with this social worker. She was African. Birmingham Council has hired a great many Nigerians as social workers. Her accent was very strong, and although not as undecipherable as the doctors at the hospital, there were times when I had to ask her to repeat something she'd said. I want to stress here that I am very aware of the tendency of some foreigners in this country to take offence when we don't understand them. So I was always very polite and said something like, "I'm ever so sorry, but I didn't catch that. Please could you say it again?" In one conversation, during which I had asked her twice to repeat something, she flew off the handle, accused me of being racist, and hung up. Now, it seems to me that that woman wasn't very good at her job, if she did something like that, even if he was being unpleasant, because it's her job to deal with people like that. That's what a social worker is for. However, it is not Matthew's fault that he couldn't understand her accent. Anyway, so this woman accused him of being a racist and hung up. I phoned a friend who's a mid-level manager in Birmingham Council and told him what had happened. He told me that the council has a policy of treating accusations of racism as true until they're proven otherwise. So again, this is one of those situations where English common law has been completely ditched, because in English common law you are assumed to be innocent unless you are proved guilty. You are not supposed to have to prove your innocence. But it doesn't look like Birmingham Council knows about that. There are other cultures under which various groups living in this country have a different attitude to the proof of innocence. There are other cultures where you have to prove your innocence rather than the other way round. And it looks like Birmingham Council has been captured by that thoroughly distasteful way of finding justice. Okay, so this friend told him that the council has a policy of treating accusations of racism as true until they're proved otherwise. Even if I could prove that I wasn't being racist by asking her to repeat herself, the process would take a long time, during which Dad's care could be affected. You see, it wasn't just that she accused him of being, Matthew, of being racist. Could have affected the way his father had got medical care. That's quite nasty, isn't it? And anyway, he said, I couldn't prove it. His very reluctant advice was to email an apology to the social worker and copy in her boss, the chair of social services and Dad's local counsellor. I didn't. I drove to Birmingham, packed some belongings and brought Dad to my home. I phoned my GP and the county social services, telling them that Dad was now living with me. It took only a few weeks until he got a flat in a local sheltered accommodation home. He lived there for 4 years until he passed away. And here you see another situation where the NHS or the social services worked very well. This man took his father out of a situation which he reckoned it could not be handled, took him to live in his home, and within a few weeks the local authority had allocated this old fellow his own special place to live, sheltered accommodation, which means a small flat and somebody on site in case of an emergency. I mean, how many countries do that? And isn't that wonderful? So, you know, it's not 100% awful. But there are many things that are wrong. And most of the things that are wrong are to do with a very British habit of not criticising the medical profession and not wishing to embarrass foreigners. And this isn't only poor old Matthew, it's the whole setup. that he found himself confronting when talking to this Nigerian lady who had a very heavy African accent. All right. Matthew talking about his father again. He was 81 when he moved home. Apart from his 7 years in the Royal Navy, he'd never lived more than 2 miles from the house where he was born, in Birmingham. He was a Brummagem through and through, what we call an old end Brummie, and fiercely proud of his city. But he absolutely loved his new home, and despite his failing health, he was very happy there. One day, several months after his move, he told me how happy he was. He said, "You see, son, I used to love Brummagem, but it's all turned to shit." Okay, well, there you have the good, the bad and the ugly. You have the marvellous parts of our social system here which work, and you have the awful parts. It's not all bad, but if you're caught in a hospital with a doctor to whom you can hardly speak, who is willing to put his name to a lie on a medical record, I'd say that's a problem that no amount of sheltered housing is going to solve. Okay, till next time. You can help my channel by subscribing and clicking the notification bell. That's quite important. And by sharing if you're so inclined. Links to my other channels and to donation methods are in the description. But the best way you can help is simply by clicking like and notify. Thank you.